I used to think a house was just walls and a roof. Then Margaret died, and I understood it was never about the walls at all. She passed on a Tuesday morning in late October, which felt wrong somehow. Margaret had always loved October, the way the maple in our backyard turned the color of a penny, the smell of wood smoke from the neighbors' chimneys, the way the whole world seemed to slow down just enough to breathe. She used to sit in her rocking chair by the bay window with a cup of tea and just watch the leaves fall, one by one, like she had all the time in the world. I should have known October would be the month she left me. Even the season said goodbye beautifully. We had lived in that house for 31 years, a two-story colonial on Birchwood Lane in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. Nothing fancy, the kind of house where the third step on the staircase creaks no matter how carefully you step on it, where the kitchen faucet drips just a little if you don't turn it all the way, where every scratch on the doorframe marked how tall our son Daniel had grown year by year. I had painted those walls 4 times. I had retiled the bathroom myself. I had planted every bush in that front yard with my own 2 hands. My name was on the deed. I had paid off the mortgage 11 years ago. That house was mine in every way a thing can belong to a person. After the funeral, Daniel sat across from me at the kitchen table and said he was worried about me being alone. I told him I wasn't alone. I had the neighbors. I had my woodworking shop in the garage. I had my Thursday card game with the guys from my old job. I was 68 years old, not 8. I did not need a babysitter. He nodded the way young people nod when they've already made up their minds and are just waiting for you to finish talking. 3 weeks later, he called to say that he and my daughter-in-law were going to come stay with me for a while. "Just to make sure you're settled, Dad," he said. "Just until you find your footing." My daughter-in-law had recently left her job, he explained. The timing worked out. It wouldn't be long. I said that was fine, because what else do you say? He was my son. I had taught him to ride a bike in that same driveway. I had driven him to his first date. When Margaret was sick the last 2 years, Daniel had driven 3 hours every other weekend without being asked. I loved my son, and at the time, I honestly believed the arrangement would be temporary. My daughter-in-law arrived with 12 boxes, 4 suitcases, and opinions about everything. The first week, it was small things. She rearranged the spice cabinet because she said the old arrangement made no sense. She replaced the dish soap I had used for 20 years with something that smelled like synthetic lavender and made my hands itch. She moved Margaret's ceramic rooster, the one we'd bought at a craft fair in Vermont on our 20th anniversary, from the kitchen windowsill to a box in the closet because it clashed with the aesthetic. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was an adjustment period. She was used to her own space, her own routines. I was a 68-year-old man who still left his shoes by the front door and forgot to wipe down the stovetop. I tried to be accommodating. The second week, she started talking about the living room. She said the furniture was dated. She said the layout was not functional. She walked around the room with her arms crossed, tilting her head one way and then the other, like she was redesigning a hotel lobby. I watched her from the doorway and felt something tighten in my chest. That living room held 31 years. The couch where Daniel used to fall asleep during football games as a kid. The bookshelf I had built myself from reclaimed oak, every joint fitted without a single nail. And Margaret's rocking chair by the bay window. The one she sat in every October morning with her cup of tea, watching the leaves fall. My daughter-in-law said the rocking chair made the room feel small. She suggested we move it to the guest bedroom. I said no, politely but clearly. I said that chair stays where it is. She gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Of course, whatever I wanted. It was just a suggestion." By the end of the month, my son had gone back to his work schedule, driving into Columbus every morning and not returning until evening. I was alone in the house with my daughter-in-law most of each day. And slowly, without any single moment I could point to, the house began to feel like hers. She had her sister over twice a week. They sat at my kitchen table and talked loudly about things I had no part in while I retreated to my woodworking shop in the garage. She started buying groceries according to her preferences without asking what I liked. She rearranged the bedroom Daniel was using without mentioning it, throwing out an old lamp of Margaret's that had been in there for years. I found it on the curb on trash day. I brought the lamp back inside. She didn't say anything about it. Then one afternoon in January, I came in from the shop to find two men in my living room with measuring tape. My daughter-in-law introduced them as the guys from the furniture place. She had apparently ordered a new sectional sofa. I asked her when she had planned to mention this to me. She said she had thought I would be pleased. She said the old furniture was worn out. She said it was going to look so much better. I said I hadn't agreed to change the furniture. She looked at me the way someone looks at a child who doesn't understand how the adult world works. Then she said something I will never forget for as long as I live. She said, "George, this isn't just your house anymore." I stood very still. The two men with the measuring tape went quiet. I said, "Excuse me?" She said it again, more slowly, as if the problem had been my hearing. "This isn't just your house anymore. We live here too. We have a right to make it livable." I asked the two men to please leave. They packed up their tape measures and went without a word. My daughter-in-law watched them go and then turned to me with an expression that had moved past apologetics straight into something harder. I went to the garage and sat in there for a long time without turning on any lights. I did not tell Daniel that evening. I told myself I didn't want to cause problems between husband and wife. I told myself she was young, that she was used to getting her way, that this would pass, but the truth was simpler than that. I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. Margaret had always been the one who handled conflict with words. I was the one who built things, fixed things, stayed quiet. I was not practiced in the art of fighting for what was already mine, so I stayed quiet. And my silence was the most expensive mistake I almost made. The sectional sofa arrived the following week while I was at my Thursday card game. I came home to find my old furniture gone, and a gray sectional the size of a small aircraft carrier filling the living room. Margaret's rocking chair had been moved. I found it in the corner of the guest bedroom, facing the wall. I carried it back to the bay window myself. My daughter-in-law watched me from the kitchen doorway but said nothing. But that night, I heard her on the phone in the upstairs hallway. The old house carried sound better than people realized. I heard her say, "He can't just keep living in the past. If we're going to be here, it has to actually work for us." And then, after a pause, "I don't know. I just think eventually he's going to have to accept that things are different now." I lay in bed that night and looked at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about Margaret. I thought about what she would have done. Margaret had been quietly fierce in a way I had always admired from a safe distance. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She just became immovable, like a tree that has decided it is not going anywhere regardless of the weather. I decided to think. I am a retired electrician. For 40 years, I solved problems by looking at the whole system before I touched a single wire. You don't just yank out a breaker and hope for the best. You understand the circuit first. So I started paying attention to the circuit. My daughter-in-law had no income of her own since leaving her job. Daniel's salary covered their expenses, but he also had a car payment, a significant amount of student debt they were still paying down, and now the costs of living in my house. My daughter-in-law spent freely. I could see it in the packages that arrived almost daily. The new fixtures she'd bought for the bathroom without mentioning it, the grocery bills that had tripled since they arrived. Daniel was stretched thin. She was the one who held their finances, she'd mentioned once. He gave her his direct deposit and she managed the accounts. I understood then what kind of chess game I was looking at. I called my attorney in the second week of February. His name is Frank, and I have known him for 20 years. We had drawn up Margaret's will together, and then mine. I told him I needed to talk about the house. He said, "Come in Thursday morning." I did not tell anyone where I was going. I sat across from Frank in his office and explained the situation plainly, the way I would explain a wiring problem to an apprentice. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about Frank. When I finished, he said, "George, The house is yours. Her name is not on the deed. She has no legal claim to it whatsoever." I said I understood that. I said my concern was not today. My concern was what happened if this situation continued for another year, 2 years. If Daniel's name somehow came to appear on the deed. If things became complicated in ways that would require lawyers and family rupture and all the damage that comes with it. Frank nodded and said, "Let's talk about a revocable living trust." I had actually been thinking about this since the previous autumn, before any of this had happened. Margaret and I had discussed it once. A revocable living trust would allow me to transfer the property into a trust I controlled entirely during my lifetime, with my grandson Tommy named as the ultimate beneficiary. I could revoke it or change it any time I chose. But it would make the disposition of the house legally airtight in a way that a simple will does not. No probate, no contest period, no ambiguity. I told Frank I wanted to do it. He said he would draft the paperwork. I also told him there was something else. There was a property I had been watching for 2 years, a small house on Lake Erie, about 3 hours north. An older couple had been renting it out seasonally, but they had decided to sell. I had driven up to look at it once with Margaret, when she was still well enough to travel. She had stood on the porch and looked out at the water and said, "George, this is where people go when they're ready to be happy." She hadn't meant it as anything except an observation. But I had remembered it. The asking price was within what I could manage comfortably from savings and Margaret's life insurance. I had not touched that money. I had not needed to. I had been waiting, without knowing exactly what I was waiting for. I told Frank I wanted to make an offer on that property. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been planning this?" I said I wasn't sure. "Maybe since October, maybe longer." He said, "Good man," and picked up his phone. I went home that afternoon and made dinner. My daughter-in-law was out with her sister. Daniel came home around 6, and we ate together at the kitchen table, just the two of us, and talked about the Ohio State basketball season and about Tommy's school play coming up in March. It was a perfectly normal evening. I did not say a word about any of it. The trust was finalized in March. I signed the documents in Frank's office on a Wednesday morning. The house on Birchwood Lane now existed inside a legal structure that was mine to control and mine to end, but which could not be altered by anyone else, willed away in probate, or accessed without my explicit direction. Tommy would inherit it intact when the time came. Until then, I remained in full control. The Lake House offer had been accepted in February. Closing was scheduled for the first week of April. I had arranged for a contractor I trusted to do a walkthrough and confirm the inspection findings. The place needed some work, a new water heater, some rewiring in the back bedroom that I was honestly looking forward to doing myself, but the bones were good. The porch faced west over the water. On clear evenings you could see the light on the lake turn gold and then amber, and then the deep, quiet red that only happens over open water. I had already begun to feel something I hadn't felt since October. I wasn't sure what to call it. Not happiness exactly. More like direction. Through February and March, my daughter-in-law continued her renovation of our life on Birchwood Lane. She had the kitchen repainted without asking. She replaced the curtains in the front room. She began referring to the house as our place in conversations with her sister, and once, on a phone call I wasn't meant to hear, she said something about eventually making it fully ours. I did not react. I went to my woodworking shop, and I built things. I built a small bookshelf for Tommy's room at the lake house. I built a new frame for the porch swing I planned to hang on the western-facing porch. I worked quietly and methodically, and I thought about the water, and I waited. In the middle of March, my daughter-in-law sat down across from me at the kitchen table while Daniel was at work. She had a particular expression I had come to recognize, studied seriousness, like someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say. She told me she wanted to talk about the long-term situation. She said that she and Daniel had been thinking, and they felt it would make sense for them to take over the mortgage. I gently reminded her there was no mortgage and perhaps to formally work out the ownership situation in a way that reflected that they were maintaining the household. I let her finish. Then I said, "What ownership situation are you referring to?" She said it might make sense for Daniel's name to be added to the deed. She said it would simplify things and protect everyone. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "I appreciate you sharing that. I'll think about it." She seemed satisfied. She went back upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and looked out the window at the maple tree in the backyard, still bare in the late March cold, and I thought about Margaret sitting by the bay window watching leaves fall. The closing on the lake house was April 4th. I drove up alone, signed the papers, shook hands with the sellers, who were a kind couple from Sandusky in their 70s who had loved that house for decades. The wife told me she hoped whoever moved in would take care of the old apple tree on the north side of the yard. I told her I would protect it with my life. She laughed and said, "Good." I stood on the porch that evening and watched the light go gold over the water. I drove back to Columbus the next morning and said nothing. The following Saturday, Daniel was home. I asked him to sit down with me in the living room after breakfast. My daughter-in-law came in and sat down too, which I had expected. I looked at them both. I told them I had something to share. I told them I had sold the house on Birchwood Lane. The silence lasted about 4 full seconds. Then my daughter-in-law said, "What?" I said I had entered into a purchase agreement with a buyer. The closing would be in 60 days. The buyers were a young family, a couple in their 30s with 2 kids who needed space. I told them I thought the house would be good for them. My daughter-in-law stood up. I watched her face go through several colors. She said, "You can't do that." I said, "It's my house. I can." She said they lived there. She said she had put work into that house. She said she had made it better. Her voice was climbing. I said she had changed some curtains and bought a sofa. I said she was welcome to take the sofa with her when she left. Daniel hadn't said anything yet. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between shock and something else. Something that might have been recognition. My daughter-in-law said, "Where are we supposed to go?" I told her they were welcome to continue living there through the closing period, which gave them 60 days. I said I expected them to be fully moved out before the new family arrived. I told Daniel I would help them with the security deposit on an apartment if they needed it, because he was my son, and that was what fathers did. She stared at me. I said, "You told me in January that this wasn't just my house anymore. I've thought about that. You were right. In a way, it stopped feeling like my house a while ago, so I decided to make it not my house at all." She left the room. I heard her upstairs, the sound of her footsteps hard and fast across the ceiling. Daniel looked at me for a long time. He said, "Dad, where are you going?" I told him about the lake house. His expression shifted. He said, "The one you and Mom looked at?" I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would have loved it up there." I said I knew. He didn't apologize, not in words. But he came around the table and put his hand on my shoulder for a moment in a way that said what he couldn't figure out how to say out loud. That was enough for me. The next several weeks were not comfortable. My daughter-in-law moved through the house in cold silence, packing boxes with a fury that expressed itself in the way she placed things down a little too hard, opened cabinets a little too sharply. I stayed out of her way. I spent my time in the woodworking shop, finishing the bookshelf, starting a small side table for the lake house's front room. Daniel found them a 2-bedroom apartment in a building not far from his office. It was clean and modern and perfectly suited to 2 people starting over in a place that was actually theirs. I wrote the check for the deposit without complaint. He thanked me quietly. She did not. The morning they moved out, I watched the truck pull away from the driveway. My daughter-in-law did not say goodbye. Daniel hugged me at the door and said he'd call when they were settled. I said to give Tommy my love. I stood in the house alone. The gray sectional was gone. They had taken most of what they'd brought. The living room looked like it had shed a skin. I walked to the bay window. Margaret's rocking chair was still there. I sat down in it. I had never sat in it before. It had always been hers. The wood was worn smooth in exactly the places her hands had rested. The view through the bay window was the same maple, bare now in spring, just beginning to show the first tiny suggestion of green along its branches. I sat there for a long time. I did not feel like I had won something. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like closing a chapter of a book you loved, which is always sad even when the ending is right. I moved to the lake house in the second week of May. I rewired the back bedroom myself, which took 3 days and gave me a deep and specific satisfaction that I think only other electricians and woodworkers would understand, the satisfaction of a system working exactly the way it should. Every connection clean and correct and safe. I fixed the water heater. I hung the porch swing and oiled it until it moved without a sound. Tommy came up with Daniel the first weekend in June. He was 9 years old and had his grandmother's eyes and a way of becoming intensely serious about whatever he was currently interested in, which at that point was freshwater fish. He stood on the dock for 3 hours with a rod I'd found in the garage, completely absorbed. He caught one small bluegill and released it with enormous ceremony. I watched him from the porch swing and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. Daniel sat beside me at one point and said, "You seem different up here." I said I felt different. He said, "Better?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Yes." Not because the grief was gone. I still reached for the phone some evenings to call Margaret before remembering, still turned to say something to her in the morning and found only the light on the water. But the grief felt like mine now. It wasn't competing for space with anger and bewilderment and the daily discomfort of watching someone disassemble a life I had built. Daniel said he was sorry for what had happened. He said he knew his wife had been difficult. He said he should have paid closer attention. He said he hadn't understood, until it was already over, how far things had gone. I said I knew. I said I also knew that watching your father grow old is strange and sometimes frightening, and that wanting to help and not knowing how can come out sideways. I said I believed he had meant well. At the beginning, he said, she called the house an investment. I said I had suspected something like that. He said, she wasn't entirely wrong that I went along with things I shouldn't have. That was honest, and I respected him for it. I said people could be led somewhere gradually without noticing the distance they'd traveled. I said the important thing was knowing the direction you actually wanted to go. He nodded slowly. He looked out at the lake where Tommy was still standing on the dock, now holding the rod up and talking to it softly as if coaching it. He said, "What about the trust? Did you is the lake house in it too?" I told him I had updated the trust to include the lake house. I told him Tommy was the beneficiary of both properties, to be administered properly until he was an adult. I told him I had also spoken to Frank about what happened if Daniel himself wished to add the lake house to his own name at some point in the future, and that Frank had given me an arrangement that made that possible under specific conditions I felt comfortable with. Daniel said, "That's very thorough." I said 40 years of electrical work had taught me that you think about the whole system, not just the part in front of you. You consider every outcome before you make a single connection. He laughed a little. It was the laugh I remembered from when he was younger, unguarded and genuine. We sat on the porch as the afternoon light moved across the water. Tommy eventually came up from the dock and demanded to know what was for dinner and whether I had ever caught anything bigger than a bluegill in this lake, and whether it was possible to kayak to the island he could see in the distance. I told him, probably walleye. Yes, if you paddle steadily, and absolutely not today because it was almost dinner time. He accepted these answers with the focused, negotiating energy of a 9-year-old and eventually agreed to come inside. I made spaghetti. Tommy ate 2 plates and declared it better than any spaghetti he'd ever had, which I knew was not objectively true but which I accepted with appropriate grandfather's pride. After dinner, when Tommy had fallen asleep on the couch under an old blanket, Daniel and I sat out on the porch in the dark. The lake was black and perfectly still, and across the water the lights of a few distant houses reflected on the surface like scattered sparks. He said, "What's it like?" "Being here alone most of the time." I said it was quiet. He waited. I said quiet was not the same as lonely. I said I was learning the difference. He said he thought Mom would have liked that answer. I said she was the one who taught me to think about it that way. I said she used to tell me that peace of mind was something you built, like anything else, that you didn't wait for it to show up at your door. You put it together piece by piece and you kept working on it until it held. Daniel said he didn't know she had said that to me. I said she said a lot of things that I was still finding in my memory, like things packed carefully at the back of a drawer that you discover one at a time. He nodded slowly. We sat there for a while in the good quiet that exists between people who understand each other. The lake turned in the dark. An owl called from somewhere in the trees beyond the apple tree. Once and then again. I thought about Margaret standing on this porch 2 years ago in the last good season she had, looking out at the water. I thought about what she had said, that this was where people go when they're ready to be happy. At the time, I hadn't been sure I knew what she meant. I had thought she meant some kind of distant arrival, some moment in the future where things settled into ease. I understood now that she hadn't meant a moment at all. She had meant a direction, a willingness to move towards something instead of away from something, to choose the next place, not out of loss but out of intention. I had built this, quietly and without drama, the way I had built every worthwhile thing in my life. One decision at a time, one morning at a time, one piece of careful work after another. My name was on the deed to this house too, and for the first time in a long time, when I thought about a house, I thought about a home. The apple tree bloomed that spring in white and pale pink against the blue Ohio sky, exactly as the woman from Sandusky had said it would. I kept my promise to her. I kept every promise I made. That, as much as anything, is what this story is about. Not the house on Birchwood Lane, not the legal documents, not the satisfaction of a plan working out the way you designed it. It is about what you decide to hold on to and what you decide to let go, and the wisdom, which takes most of a lifetime to learn to know the difference between the two. A house is where you store the past. A home is where you build what comes next. Some mornings I sit on the porch swing before the sun is fully up with a cup of coffee and no particular agenda, and I watch the light come slowly across the water. The swing moves without a sound. The apple tree stands in the yard, patient and full of itself. The lake does what lakes do, it reflects, it shifts, it holds whatever light falls on it and gives it back changed. I am 68 years old. I am not done yet.